here and and a lot of people are on Zoom. But like first, I want to welcome everyone to the first colloquium in the spring semester of this department, and especially in this cold weather. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Bree McEwan. Dr. McEwan is a professor at the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And she earned her PhD from Arizona State University, and she's also an alum, having received her bachelor's degree here in communication at MSc. So Dr. McEwan's work is at the intersection of interpersonal communication and communication technology. She is the author of the book Navigating New Media Networks, which examines how communication technologies change interpersonal communication processes and relationships. This book received the Outstanding Book Award from the NCA's Human Communication and Technology Division. And Dr. McEwan also co-authored another book, Interpersonal Encounters, further illustrating her impact and the commitment to the field. Her research has also appeared in leading journals such as Annals of the International Communication Association and New Media and Society. More recently, her work has expanded to social virtual reality, examining how platform affordances shape social presence and interaction. This afternoon, Dr. McEwan will be presenting identifying affordances across technologies from social media to social VR. And please join me in welcoming Dr. McEwan.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be back here at MSU as a speaker. Oh, there's clap sound. I'm actually really, there's a couple times this week where I was like, January, why did we choose January? But I'm glad everyone could make it who's healthy or who is on the Zoom. A little bit in the, no restarting. There we go. A little bit in the process of getting this up here, I've lost access to the notes pages. So and I've switched some slides around this morning. So there's a couple points where the next slide might be a surprise to all of us. And we'll figure that out. Yeah. So I did start here. That's my cow. So they let me name a cow here when I was an undergraduate. But I bring this picture, obviously Michigan State Connect. But I started here studying interpersonal in the 700-person lecture hall in Wells Hall, and that's really what caught my attention as someone. I'm trying to think. I think my major at the time was PR. Before that was advertising, and then I was an education major. Clearly, did not know what I wanted to do, and then really kind of was taken in by interpersonal and the way communication studies has done it at Michigan State. And Sandy said, "You're going to go to grad school." I said, "I can't pay for that." And she said, "That's not how it works," and sent me off to this career, which has wound up at the University of Toronto. And I'm an interpersonal scholar all the way through, even on the tech journey I'm going to take you on. I'm really interested in the ways that people connect to each other, the way that they are able to make meaning through various channels, and how we manage social interaction. So small plug for interpersonal encounters. And I've ended up kind of here, right? So that's the beginning. This is our Questioning Reality conference that I run with Grace On, that focuses on social interaction and trying to bring different disciplines and industry folks together, featuring myself and Marco Denhart. And I believe this is Robbie's hand in that picture. And then that's half of my lab space over there with my current lab students playing around with a VR technology in the Apple Vision Pro. And so I had this opportunity, I'd studied interpersonal, I'd moved into tech, we've done a lot with affordances, social media, relational maintenance, etc. I had already kind of been playing around with AR and VR when I was at DePaul. When I went up to University of Toronto in 2021, I don't want to say nothing was happening, but nothing was happening in the buildings because of COVID. And so when I came back to the building, we had these lab spaces that were available. And the folks who were supposed to be in those lab spaces had sort of transitioned to other positions during COVID. And so, you know, when you have an empty lab across the hall from your office, you print out a piece of paper with your lab name on it and tape it to the door. You might just get to keep it. And so I did. And we also, you know, found some avenues. I was assigned to teach the VR class because I'd been teaching that at Paul. We found some avenues for equipment. We've worked on some, we have a shirt grant now for a learning study that we're running this year, which is our social sciences. We have an NSF for the social sciences in Canada. They don't have as much, well, they might now have as much money as NSF, but sorry. Sorry. We have a prime minister. So it's been a good spot is what I'm saying. The work that we've been able to do in kind of the resource intensive nature of VR, we are getting this started. And so you're getting kind of a talk about that moves from one avenue when we were studying social media. See, now people have to sit on the couch. That moves from thinking about social media and technology and how do you take what we really do and what we really do well in communication into this new technology. So again, let's go back to the beginning. This is not news to anyone in this room, right? But when I start to think about a new technology, and we have Fox and I have a whole thing in one book chapter somewhere about, tech doesn't just alter what things are happening. Sometimes it accommodates it, sometimes it amplifies it, but you really need to think through what that channel might be doing. I don't really actually have channels in this model, but what that channel might be doing, and then go back to your basic pieces of what is communication. And so if you take this and you apply this to the VR setting, and think of, let me say this one, think of VR as a communication channel, you get something like this, right? And so, Shannon and Weaver weren't really thinking through like a goals, plans, action side of communication. But if we're interested in how people are interacting within social VR, we have to think about what are their goals, their motivation, how do they present themselves? And then we get into, so that's the people. And then we get into the hardware. So the hardware is driving what we can and can't do. It drives if people even want to put a headset on, right? If it's heavy, if it's clunky. The first headsets we were teaching in at HD Pros, and that team was really great. They worked with us a lot. Those were really clunky, heavy headsets, and I nearly killed a grad class because we did presentations and then when we were in them for like 3 hours and we learned that idea. Mm-hmm. So, is it comfortable? What is the processing speed? Are you getting a good display? What are the degrees of freedom? All the things the engineers think about, those things can change the way that the communication process can happen, if people are going to put it on, even if they want to be in it, if it feels comfortable. And then we have things like, what's your avatar? This is, I use this like image from Ready Player Me. This is not what their actual avatars look like when you're in the thing. How much do you get to change this avatar? How much does it look like you? I will take suggestions, but we are in our lab right now in using a stimuli that rests on, using Ready Player Me avatars. And because we don't want the participants changing their avatar all the time, everybody's a bear. I don't like a weird pink bear. It's not quite the Five Nights at Freddy's bear, but it's not quite not the Five Nights at Freddy's bear, but it's pink. We're thinking this through right now because they have to interact with each other now. We're like, are they both going to be bears? Or are we changing this? So my undergrads have an assignment this weekend of coming up with a neutralish Ready Player Me avatar that does not default to white man. That's the assignment I gave them. So we'll see if that is possible and if they can come up with that. But then you get into can you display an emotion? Is it easy to control? Do you have any haptic kind of feedback? What is, how's the sound, the vocalics? What are the messages you're sharing? What does the environment look like? Does that change all of these pieces of how we make meaning and process? And so you end up, to go back a slide, you end up, if you want to think about how people are making meaning, having to think through all of these different layers and the affordances that are available via all of these different layers. And I do think a lot about affordances, and I try to not hit everything with the affordances hammer, right? Everything the nail. And so, but it will also not surprise you that last week there was an extended deadline for an IEEE workshop, and I'm like, I'm on sabbatical. I'm gonna write a paper in a day. Still got it. I did it. And I said I was gonna write on one thing, and I messaged my colleague Grace on by the end of the day. I'm like, it will not shock you that I wrote a paper about affordances. Nope, not shocked at all. And so if I'm assuming this crowd is generally aware of this concept, although I know Allison, you said you might have some undergrads who just one. Yes. So this one?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I heard you just learned about what affordances are. It's like I'm never coming back.
So this is one and done.
You can tell the rest of the class later. So when we think about affordances, we can go back to the original Gibson idea, which was about animals. And we are currently, hopefully, finishing up a handbook of relational and computer-mediated communication, which is Art Ramirez is leading that project. Erin Sumner is leading that project, and with Jeff Hall. But Fox has a chapter where she does a deep dive into the history of affordances, and I was the editor on that one. So just giving a little plug for that chapter, because you do go back to thinking about how, the animals think about, well, they don't think about, but how they engage with the environment around them. And it reminded me that it's not just humans, and then it's not just the environment, is what can that animal do, right? The bear cannot be a fish. And so the fish has different affordances of water than the bear does. I think this is Otis from Fat Bear Week, is the picture. It's in my notes, right? If Otis wants the shore to be his yoga mat, he can figure that out. It's not always the exact same thing. And so then we kind of transition into Norman. And again, Fox in that chapter kind of reminds us that Gibson and Norman were contemporaries, like having this argument back and forth. This is not just a straight line of this sort of perceived affordances. What do you see in a channel? And that leads you to, how you can use that channel. What is it good for? What do you think the functions are? What norms sort of emerge? And the ways that we put that into meaning. So to be a little bit more specific, here's a couple of definitions and things we're not telling Jesse Fox. I like this one better. We were writing at the same time, these two teams. These two articles came out at pretty much the exact same time. Ours was a measurement. Theirs is, it's operationalization and conceptualization, right? They were working on the conceptualization. We were doing the operationalization. Right, but this sort of multidimensional relationship and how that relationship offers possibilities and outcomes from the user's interactions. And then this is the piece I really love about that Evans article, is this thresholds of affordances to really get you to think through. It can't be a feature. And this is the one we kind of see all the time in the review process. Or I was now I'm a sociologist. I'm doing grad appointments in sociology. So I was at ASA, and the student was giving a talk on affordances. And she was like, so the features are, affordances. And I was like, don't be that person. Don't be that person. I was like, that's not how it works. But they're not features, right? So if it's, the armchair is not the thing, but the comfort, right? The ability to put down your arm is the thing. It's not the outcome. So it's not the Google results that you get, right? It is searchability, is the affordance. And it's not a binary, right? There has to be some variance. This is good for us, right? Because if there's variance, we can measure it as variance, and now we can throw it in all kinds of models and things and see how the variance in the affordance changes potential other effects. So, this sort of, I don't want to hit everything with a hammer of affordances, but I do find affordances to be a useful construct to come back to, particularly when thinking through a new technology. And so we've got some quotes up there. I'm going to give the second sentence, that's a Jesse sentence for sure. Maybe. And so when we think about the affordances of a technology, we've argued in many places that this is what allows us to extrapolate to other technologies. This gets us out of the trap of, If you change the platform, you know, have you changed the effect? Well, did you change the affordance? And if you change the affordance, then yeah, theoretically, that makes sense that the effect changes. And now we're not doing, you know, like MySpace studies. You guys even remember MySpace? I mean, yeah, some of you, right? Some of you are like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it helps us, this is the piece that I like. It helps us take this meaning making process to the forefront, right? Because now it's not about this like tool and thinking through it the way, you know, an engineer or computer scientist might think through it, which are not bad ways to think through it, right? Interdisciplinary work is great, but it brings our work as communication scholars to the forefront of thinking through the affordance, and our initial engagement with the tool and with the technology is already part of the meaning making process, right? It's already part of communication and what we do here. And when you change, sure, if you change features, maybe you're changing affordances or not, but starting there allows you to kind of get a sense of the big picture of what might happen. And I would say if we're going to theorize about affordances, we have to measure that affordance. And I think this second point is not like a surprise to people in this room, but there is an argument particularly in VR, in the engineering side of things. I think Mel Slater is probably the biggest proponent of this particular argument, but it's out there that we shouldn't be measuring perception at all, right? You should just measure it by like how people physically like interact with it. Kind of the idea, right, with cognition, that if I, you know, can measure how fast you push the button, that's maybe a little easier than, or not easier, but maybe that's more accurate for certain things than asking you how easy it was to push the button. We do get that. But there is also a point that if affordances are in the eye of the beholder, if they're the perception of the user, then we probably have to ask the user, right, what they saw and how they saw it. And then we have to build kind of quality measures to be able to do that, that go beyond sort of physical measures. And I say this because I feel like I'm starting to enter this conversation with a couple of things that we've done, where the review comes back of, we've given up on perceptual measures, they don't work. And I was like, just because a computer scientist wrote a measure that didn't work does not mean that we give up on perceptual measures. So you may be familiar with this one. I looked it up this morning, it's like 500 citations. Yay. We did not set out to measure affordance. We did. We set out to do a research project on romantic relationships. You might notice we never did that. But in the process of that research project, we went, oh, there's different measures of these things that people have used at different times, but there's not like a wholesale measure that gets at a bunch of different affordances. I would also like to say, you know, there's 11 up here. There's only 10 in the official measure because it's really hard to get editability and synchronicity to play together. They kind of tap into the same thing. I will also say, just to take out some arguments, I don't know if I've had a direct argument with someone, but I've had arguments in like the review process of things, where someone said like, well, Fox and McEwan say that there's 10 affordances. That's not quite what Fox and McEwan meant. Fox and McEwan meant these are an important 10 affordances that we measured in this particular scale. There's many affordances as we can perceive, right? But these are ones that come up quite often. And so we ended up in this process of how do you think through these particular affordances, and then spent quite a bit of time, multiple samples, getting a really good measure of this together. We both won an award and we're told that we're everything wrong in the field on the same day. So depends on who you're talking to. This is a wall of numbers, but my wall of numbers makes the point that across these different channels have different constellations of affordances. So you really can't, you know, think through just like one affordance. You have to think about how these things sort of play together, how they're perceived together. You end up with things like, you know, email and texting, particularly if you're doing it both on your phone, look very similar, but the social norm of it kind of drives a different affordance, where texting is often seen as more synchronous than something like email. And so again, we're back to this sort of complicated, all of these things sort of coming together, and how do you start to dig into what is going to have an effect on the meeting process. And this is really kind of how I'm starting to like lean into what our lab is doing in VR research, is not just, oh, we'll throw people in VR and we'll compare that to face-to-face. Okay, I can run that t-test, but that's not super exciting, right, to me. But what is the thing in this VR? And someone asked the question this morning, maybe it was, I can see the four of you in front of me in the conversation. Somebody asked a question about like, you know, what's the important thing to study in VR? And it's kind of, we miss a lot of times, it's like, what VR, right? Like, what hardware are you using, and what software is it, and what's the motivation, and what is the function you're trying to achieve, and what's the goal of that, and is it augmented or is it immersive, and all of these things change the affordance within what we often think of as this sort of monolithic, oh, I study VR, right? And so I'm in this thing. So if we start from the affordances that Jesse and I were thinking about, James Cummings, thank you, at Boston University, did a survey. So they did a prolific sample, I think it was prolific, and you had to be a monthly user of social VR, which I think these days is actually a pretty heavy user. I don't get in social VR every month. To be a monthly user of social VR, my suspicion reading that description of the sample is most of these folks are VR chat users. And probably using it through a Quest. And they threw our measure in and said, which of these sort of work out in social VR? To which I was both grateful because somebody did it and I don't have to do it now. And also like, oh, I missed that one. That was an easy, an easy get. But I think they did a great job, and it's nice when someone else finds your work useful. And so they have, if you want to get into the paper, you can look at their, statistical significance between different channels and how all this works out. For our point today, I've kind of highlighted with the circles, ignore the star for a second, the ones that come up above 5 on a 7-point scale. Bit arbitrary to choose that, but the reason I've done that is because almost nothing was below the midpoint, right? So the midpoint is not super useful to me here. Everything would show up. But what comes up above 5? Like, what are people seeing as sort of a unique-ish, it's a great word, unique-ish affordance of social VR? So you did get bandwidth. You got access, which I thought was weird, because access is about, this is a channel that's easy for me to access and reach people on. And I don't actually think that's a good affordance of most social VR, because I don't think, even though I think we both have access to headsets, I don't often like message Alice and be like, let's get in. I think never, actually. Once, because we did it for QR once. We had to do it. So I forced you once, right? Yeah, you gotta charge things. Yeah, Messenger's much easier. But I did think, oh, if these are VR chat users and they've met friends via VR chat, and there are people who get into it once a month, they might be like, yeah, it's super easy. I put on my headset and there's a list of all my friends, and there they are. And so it really then depends, again, when you're measuring this, who the user is, right? Who the sample is. Network association was high too. And again, I think this is a bit channel dependent. It's not about social VR. It's about the fact that VR chat serves you up a list of your users. It articulates the network for you, much like a social network site. And so you're getting high network association based on the channel the sample is using, not necessarily based on all of the technologies that come under this rubric. You do get social presence. You get some personalization, right? I think it's kind of in the avatar. I get to personalize the avatar. Conversational control comes out high, similar to face-to-face. I feel like I can kind of control where this is going and understand folks. And anonymity, I think is the last one. Yeah. Hold on. So, okay, so those are the ones we have for social VR. And there's a version of this talk where I also talk about adoption. I love that because like you're all kind of on the bandwagon. But there's an interest here of like, well, what does social VR do for us that other channels don't do for us? Because that might be what drives if people are going to choose to use it or not. And so these little stars, again, not statistically significant stars, but they are, the bigger the star, visual, the bigger the star, the bigger the difference here is what I'm going to talk about. And so where you see a blue star, that means face to face is lower on the scale than social VR. So access, which is weird. I think we're just going to toss that as an artifact of the study. Network association, okay. But then the other two are conversational control. You feel like you have a little bit more control in social VR. And they felt like they had more anonymity. And again, I think this is VR chat users, but this is maybe our sort of general social user in this scale. And then the other one is video conferencing. So we can think like Zoom, where you see a pink star, social VR scores a bit higher than the pink star. And again, the one that comes out is anonymity. And so while I'm not going to get deep into adoption today, it does mean something if you're trying to design VR systems, which is a lot of the use cases that you see if you go to an industry conference, you get, oh, it's going to be great for education because it's immersive. So many theoretical arguments in that sentence that are not measured, right? And we have to think about we should use it for meetings, right? We should get our whole workplace in it and use it for meetings. And none of these are anonymous, right? And in this particular study, maybe because of the particular sample, the big thing that drove people to use this is they got to have kind of a face-to-face-ish conversation and some conversational control, but being totally anonymous. That's a way different constellation of affordances that I hear a lot of the designers thinking about. So again, there are not just 10 affordances in the world, right? Or 11 even. The question my lab had, starting now, I made the lab have, is what are the social VR affordances that are not social media affordances? And this is a little bit of a tricky problem to work through. Because with the original affordances scale, see, we're getting into the qualitative and Ron's leaving. No, he warned me. Thanks, Ron. And so we had to think with the original scale, we had a lot of measures that we could kind of pull from and kind of pull together as potential affordances, and we could start from that sort of model. But we didn't have that for social VR. There's also the point you can't like bring in participants and say, what do you think the affordances are? Right? They don't know. And if you start to lead them down that garden path of what affordances are, have you just put in a demand characteristic and they're just spitting back to you what they think you want to hear? We wanted to avoid that as well. So what we ended up doing is we did an experiential study. An older group, well, I guess they are older, in the lab. And so we brought them in. They had a VR experience in a program called Engage. If you're familiar with that program, I'm pretty sure MSU doesn't count because I think Robbie uses it. They have lots of different environments, but we put them specifically in a classroom. They had to draw a picture on the board together, the dyads. We didn't give them any instructions beyond that. So they did have to kind of like figure out all these pieces of the program themselves. And there's some like weird stuff where you couldn't actually both draw on the board at the same time. So they had to talk through that. So we gave them a task to do. We made them take a picture of their drawing too. And like, that didn't even save. Like they have no idea. They're like, oh, they want pictures of drawings. Because what we wanted them to do is have a task so that they would talk to each other, have this social experience. They're in this particular environment. And then what we really were interested in at the end of the day was the interview that we did afterwards, where we asked them questions like, what do you feel you could do in the space? Or one is like, what could you do in space? What did you want to do in the space that you couldn't do, which does drive some of our results? How is this different? In what ways is face-to-face better? In what ways would this be better? Just these sort of general questions to try to get them in there. We have about 80 of these total. There's 53 in today's analysis. one of my grad students did tell me yesterday that they're all transcribed now, so now we can get all 80 in. Because we wanted to go back and ask a question about avatars that's not in today's. So we found a bunch, and I'm going to preface this with, I don't believe all of these are affordances. We can argue in the Q&A about which ones are and which ones aren't. These are the themes we're seeing so far. Some of them are affordances, some of them are affordance-like. But a big one was bandwidth, right? Which is something that Fox and I had pinned as, the number of nonverbal cues. We also like the term bandwidth because it has like a computer science meaning. And so these are actually avatars from a different project, but you can kind of think if you could make faces, what that might look like. We used the facial action coding scheme from this project to create those. But in our engage avatars, they don't have any facial expressions. And I know from teaching in that space, that is a tricky thing. It is almost sometimes feels worse than the Zoom black boxes because like the people are there, they're doing nothing. And one cannot not communicate, even when it is your avatar not communicating. Are you listening? Are you there? Are you in there? Right, so I appreciate not having to keep up with facial expressions. So you're getting the variance here, right? There's some nonverbal, but not a lot. I can see your hair here in the physical world. I can see your hair move with the gravity. I was like, that's something. I can understand that you're listening to me and you're understanding me. And in VR, maybe I'm less sure, right? Maybe you're saying something, but I'm not getting feedback. I'm not getting back channeling, and it's a little more difficult to communicate. We did get anonymity. We had a whole strategy of bringing them into the two sides of the labs where they didn't see each other. So this is kind of part of this process. So we didn't see each other. So there wasn't like a secret bias or judgment happening. We had talked with the students earlier about UTM students, for whatever reason, they're not super social. They're not really outspoken or, and so I do get it for a few of them. They're like, I actually like this because I felt like I got to talk to someone, but they didn't know it was me. And so my physical appearance is hidden, so I feel like I can disclose more and have more confidence. I did think about at the end of the interview, we throw them out in the hall and then the person's there, right? They're leaving together. And I was like, I don't know what happened at that point. We did get some social presence, which is good because that is one of the things that the VR hype side of the industry argues, right? That you'll get social presence, but there's a question of if you get more social presence than something like video conferencing that might be easier to use. They felt like they were co-present. They were reciprocating the conversation. We were walking together. It was us going through new places. I actually think this participant was just after an Engage update. So there used to be a door in the back of the classroom and it went nowhere. You just open the door and they're like, oh, it doesn't go anywhere. And so I'm listening to them and they're like, oh, there's a door back here. I'm like, and it will go nowhere. And then I hear the participant go, oh, there's posters out here. I was like, what? Where have you gone? What are you doing? They just added a hallway. So it's great. Thanks for changing that in the middle of my study. Spatial presence is a thing, and I'm trying to decide if what the participants are talking about here is spatial presence, like the I am there. This category does feel different from social presence, that we are here together, but there is something here where it's like we could get to the same place that feels a bit different than spatial presence and a bit different than social presence. I'm going, thanks Caleb Clark for the word disentrained, right? I'm going with disentrained shared space for the minute. Ability to experience the same digital environment as other people. We can be in the same area. There's no like travel restrictions. They could see this is them talking about how they might use it in the future, right? They can see the utility of that. We did in some of the stuff I'm working through for one of the white papers for questioning reality, I was like, what could VR be like in 20 years or 5 years? I think it was 5 years, and this is 2024 in the spring, and someone wrote down, well, if Trump gets reelected, we can go places without visas. Like, thanks for being on the nose there, guys. That's great. And so, but we can get to the same place, which is interesting, which I think we don't feel like in Zoom, right? In Zoom, we feel like we are all in different places, and I can see you in your place, but here we're in the same place. I'm trying to figure out how we'll kind of tear apart that social presence in place. This is kind of labeled realism at the moment, but we did do a measure of physical fidelity, which is one type, and we're making this difference between realism, which could be like how, like, does it look like a real place, or does it look, you know, cartoony or abstract as realistic, and fidelity being, can I apply the cognitive heuristics I have of a space to this space? We're actually using that in the studies we're doing right now, because we're doing a cognitive load and learning study, and we're changing the environment from something that looks exactly like a classroom at UTM to like weirder and weirder and weirder. I think there's like a giant honey bear and dunes at the end of the scale. It gets weird. And so, but I could have a very cartoony looking classroom that I can apply that heuristic to. So again, we're trying to think through these like granular notions of the difference between fidelity and realism. And again, there's like variation, right? Like drawing on the board, and it kind of felt real a little bit. There's the graphics being improved, right? There's some of the movement things. So this all sort of still needs to be pulled apart. You could sort of fly down the stairs. And then we also had participants talking about, you know, the interaction. There's chairs here and I can sit in them, but there's a table and I can't lay on it or I can't touch it. And this is actually kind of an issue we see in lots of different VR spaces. The sort of the science fiction version of VR is you can go in and do anything, right? You can fly, you can move everything around, you can create anything you want to, but really you can only do what is coded into the program. And so we do run into this where people are like, I got into it and then I was like, I want to move this chair and it didn't do anything. I can't even touch it. I'm like through the chair. They did talk about physical and sensory feedback. In most cases, it was, you know, I wanted that feeling, but it wasn't there. And so you're seeing through a few of these, right? This, whatever sort of idea that the participants had of VR coming into it, a lot of them had not used VR before. We do have this measure somewhere in the study of how familiar they were with VR and how often they'd used it. The affordance was salient to them, but was not there. And so you get this kind of, I feel like it should be affording this to me, but it is not, which is a little bit different than other technologies and probably drives, you know, how much you like that interaction and being able to engage in that. I wanted to touch the tablet, right? But the way that you use this tablet, you have to go through it. And that feels weird. I couldn't touch the person, so that felt kind of weird. But then there's this quote. It felt personal because at the end we had that and we could feel the vibration when our virtual hand touched. And that software at that time did not have that capability. I don't know what happened there. But it does bring us back to, it is the perception of the user, right? Something happened. They must have hit something or something vibrated. And at that moment of high five, it just happened. And they're like, it does that. And I could just imagine this person going back to this, you know, space and being like, we can high five, and trying it over and over again. But I do love this one because it's not there in the features, but it did feel like an affordance. They talk a lot about representation. We did let them change their avatars in this particular study. And then we've added some questions in about that. You know, could you be you? I wanted to look like a queen because I wanted to be more confident and fit this character. If I have to meet someone that I don't know. I wanted to know, it might not be the real me, but I want you to know that version of me, right? So this is something that kind of comes out in a lot to the answer to, why is this better than face-to-face? Like, well, face-to-face, I'm stuck with whatever version I could pull together in the negative, you know, 15-degree weather or whatever we've got going on today. I have straight hair today because it is way too dry for there to be any waves. Whereas my avatar could probably have curly hair or whatever it is that I wanted. And then you get to choose, right? So that choice that the other person is making is telling you something about how they want to be perceived, which is why we're making them all be bears to take that out. But you know, one cannot communicate, so I'm a little worried about the bears. The embodiment felt off, right? The other person's behavior is weird. I think if you've been in VR, you've all seen like this, right? Where they take out the headset or you go like this and it's back. I could see her hand when she was drawing, but her hand wasn't moving. The drawing was just happening, and that felt kind of weird. And so the lack of synchronization often came up. We didn't get a lot of people feeling that I felt embodied in my avatar. It was the other person was supposed to be embodied in their avatar, but it was a little off, and that was, you know, catching my attention. This one I don't think is an affordance. This is the one they're kind of going in order of like of most affordancy to least affordancy. But it is part of the experience. So if it glitches, I cannot tell you how many arguments. Well, I haven't had the arguments because my media technician won't let me, but how many arguments my media technician has had with our IT department about the Wi-Fi in the lab. We've gotten there, and we also have a secret. Don't tell them. So we've solved a lot of these things, but you could see people having these issues at home. And then, you know, I felt like I was shouting, or the sound wasn't working. And this then influences the experience and it influences the communication process because all of a sudden I'm not having the same kind of conversation I would have with you in face to face because I'm talking and nothing's happening. So we end up, oh, perfect. We end up with kind of this collection. I'm not yet ready, although maybe there's some next steps where we refine some of these. Realism probably has to be broken out and think about maybe the ways that we measure some of these, at least for manipulation checks that I want to have in some of the studies. And we're really thinking through, you know, how we're building through the lab based on this kind of affordance perspective, even if it doesn't come out in sort of the next paper. So one, in the realism, that one level of like, I know it's tiny, don't worry about it. But we did a measure of physical fidelity. Because again, I wanted to have this kind of like the original affordance scale. I wanted to use a manipulation check to make sure that the participants were seeing these as having different levels of fidelity, these environments we created for the study we're doing now. And I sent Clarice Wu, my undergrad, off to, you know, go look up the fidelity measures and go find them. And she came back and she goes, I think I'm doing it wrong. You're very smart. Why do you think you're doing it wrong? Because I wasn't lying. Everyone who was saying they were measuring perceived fidelity was either using an immersion measure, a presence measure, or the self-assessment mannequin. Still not sure on that one. And so I once again found myself in the position of writing a measure to do a project, but we've almost got that one in publication. And then we're using that as the manipulation check in the bigger study we're doing now on cognitive load and fidelity. We've got some students who've been interested in emotion. So you saw those faces. Those were created by Barry Zhang, who's a student going off to grad school soon somewhere. And so now we've got controllable emotions, at least the big six. We're going to get into some more granular happy ones because we realize the big six emotions are mostly negative. And we can't, we're almost like, wait, if we're having people who don't know each other come together and have a conversation, like how often are they going to be like, angry? Like that's not likely to happen unless they're just playing with it. But we will be able to kind of control that, and we will be able to kind of play with, do participants know that the emotions are controlled, or do they think they're not controlled? Do they think they're random, kind of like Rec Room, and how that might change things? And we're thinking through some other computational processes of how to get to avatar emotion as well. And then as we go through, we'll, you know, think through somehow these other affordances work out as well. So, why should you care, right? Besides, I was willing to come here in January and give you a talk. Thanks. Because I think the theory matters, right? And I think this is such an interdisciplinary space, and we're all coming from such theoretical, different perspectives. It's really important to sort of ground ourselves in the communication, symbolic interaction, meaning making side of things to think through how social interaction will work in VR. Because as Grace and I have made this argument in various places, that is what drives VR is a communication technology. And that is what will drive it forward, is understanding the way that social interaction happens within virtual reality, augmented, mixed, et cetera. It helps us understand how people will make sense of environments that people are creating. When we include affordances in design thinking, we get, you know, better designs. So when we built these new stimuli And we trained my colleague Michael Nixon trained undergraduate students in Unity to build out the stimuli for the lab. We started with affordances and design thinking. Like, what are the affordances of a classroom? So all the way through, even if it's lily pads, you have display, you have a space for the instructor, you have a space for the students to meet, you have a space to sit. You don't have a place to take notes because that's not an affordance of VR. But we're thinking through, like, what are the things you want people to do? And then you can have fun with it and play with it, but you need to have the affordances there. So informing the development of social VR. And then it's the beginning of our meaning making process. It starts with perception and cognition and how people engage in communication processes from the very beginning. That's the talk. Small, shameless plug. Oh, that's me. For those of you in the room who are doctoral students at the proposal stage of your dissertation, please remember that the deadline for the ICA Doctoral Consortium is February 2nd. Join us in South Africa. There is a link to the application form on my Blue Sky or LinkedIn if you would like to get there, or you can email me and I will send it to you.
Dr. McEwan for this wonderful talk. So now we have a Q&A session. So although I don't have a microphone with me today, but like I will pretend that I have one. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and I will go to you one by.
Well, this is all very new to me. I'm not a media scholar.
Me neither.
An interpersonal scholar.
Okay.
Is an